We do want to welcome you to this February lunch lecture and are glad that it is today rather than yesterday, the weather being so much better today. And as announced, our talk today will be on the other mission to the Cherokee in what is now North Georgia. The Spring Place, of course, is the one we have heard most about, and it was the main station, so of course it would get most of the attention. But we did have a secondary station there, and so we want to be sure they get their moment in the spotlight as well. And this was the mission at Uchgalogi. And I'll say a lot more about the name shortly in the second part of the lecture. Actually, the lecture today is in two parts. One, where I simply talk and tell you what happened. And then Richard has put together a slideshow that will deal with some of the other matters and some of the physical evidence which is or was until recently there. Now, by way of background, and you will recall that our Cherokee mission got off to a slow and rocky start. The idea of evangelizing the Native Americans in this area was with us from the beginning of the Moravian settlement here in 1753, but it had to be put on the back burner for about 50 years for various circumstances. Such matters as the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War and the building of Salem and other concerns meant that we simply could not do from the beginning all that we would have wished in that. However, by 1799, things had settled down enough that we began to talk about, well, what about a mission? And that was prompted by some folks in the North who were starting some Indian missions, and so we sort of latched onto that enthusiasm. And so in 1799, we sent an exploratory group out, as Moravians often do, to sort of suss out the situation. And to keep this short, by 1800, the Cherokee National Council had given approval for us to actually begin a mission there. And in 1801, in April, Abraham Steiner and Gottlieb Behan actually went down to make the first beginnings. And there, of course, they ran into James Vann, whom you will recall from other lectures was a right character in his own sort, a very respected man amongst the Cherokee, but who had a wild streak in him, and you never knew which James Vann you were going to hit. And so he was very, very kind to us. He got us agreements for land and loaned some of his own servants to us to help clear things and cultivate. Helped us out in all sorts of ways, but unfortunately was killed while under the influence of strong drink. Anyway, but the mission continued. The Behans and the Wolfarts carried it on. We finally were getting established, and you will recall also that the reason the Cherokee wanted us to come was not to evangelize them, but to start a school, because they realized early on that their only hope of resisting white encroachment and continuing to exist in this wave of white migration that was flowing around them and through them was to become conversant in English and learn enough arithmetic that they could tell whether they were being cheated and such things like that. So that's why they allowed us to come. And by 1803, they were getting a little impatient that we hadn't actually started the school after 3 years. And there was a sort of ultimatum that we had to get going. And so in 1804, we did begin the school with only 4 pupils. And things went slowly on from there. In spite of our efforts to evangelize the Cherokees, our first convert was not until 1810, 10 years after we started the mission. And this was Peggy, who was James Van's widow, appropriately enough. And she proved a very, very good member and inspiring to her friends and relatives. And at one point, the missionaries referred to her as our best evangelist. So we had a good relation there. Now, following James Van's death, she was a widow for a while, but in 1812 she married Joseph Crutchfield, who was the overseer of her plantation there. And that will have repercussions slightly later. Still, things are going along. Charles Hicks, a very prominent person in the Cherokee Nation, was baptized in 1813, and him we will hear much more of later. So by 1812, things really were beginning to look positive until the War of 1812, and things had to sort of grind to a halt for a while. The Cherokee were sent out to fight on the United States side, and many of our converts or friends were among them. But we survived the war without any undue disaster. And so by 1817, Charles Hicks, whom I just mentioned as having joined the church in 1812, was elected the second principal chief of the entire Cherokee Nation. So if you only have a few members, having the second principal chief is a good one to have. And his importance was even greater because the first principal chief at that time was elderly and couldn't get around much, so actually Charles Hicks, in effect, functioned as principal chief of the Cherokee. We had students along, not too many at a time, but steadily. And so by 1818, 5 pupils who had been in the Moravian school at Spring Place were sent to Connecticut to the Cornwall Institute for further instruction. The idea being that they would then come back and work amongst their people in education and other positive things. They did stop here in Salem on their way up and wrote some letters back home, which you will find in the forthcoming volume when you purchase it. And also some other descriptions of their experiences in Philadelphia. Anyway, but things are beginning to look up. On his tour of the southern states, President Madison took note of the Moravian mission to the Cherokee, but was too busy to actually stop by for a visit. Anyway, we were recognized by the government. The government had been giving us $100 a year to further the work of our mission. And in 1820, the Secretary of War, and I've always thought it interesting that the United States put Indian Affairs under the Secretary of War, which is a pretty good guarantee of how things are going to go. But anyway, the Secretary of War in 1820 was John C. Calhoun. And he increased our yearly stipend to $250 a year. And this was part of the U.S. government's policy of, quote, civilizing the Indians. We could have a whole series of lectures on that idea, but that's the term of the time. Anyway, it meant that we had enough money to make some improvements there at Spring Place, and also to begin to think about, is there more we can do? There was, of course, always doubt about whether the Cherokee would get to keep their land or not, even this early. But at this time, the U.S. government assured the Cherokee that, yes, the land is yours forever. You need have no fear of being forced off your land. We know what happened with that, too. But at the time, everybody bought the government assurance. And converts began to increase there at Spring Place, a couple more, and that only meant 5 formal members, but there was a good number of adherents who were looking towards joining the church. So it was beginning to be a not large, but at least sizable group of people there that we were serving. And so they began to ask, do we need another mission station? especially since some of our members did not live close by Spring Place, but were many miles away and had to travel a good bit to get there for services when they could, when weather permitted, and all of that sort of thing. So, as usually happened when the authorities in Salem were considering a step in this direction, they sent Abraham Steiner on another exploratory trip in 1819 and to see what the prospects were and to make some suggestions for a possible second mission. And this was important because William Hicks and Major Ridge, another Cherokee leader, and Wattie, another Cherokee leader, who lived down near the new capital of New Echota, the Cherokee national capital at the time, were beginning to say, can't we have a mission in our area? And it would also be to your advantage to have a station near the Cherokee capital. And Steiner agreed with that. And we have numerous letters from these Cherokee leaders, sort of a writing campaign urging us to actually begin the mission. Now, this was 18 miles south of Spring Place, but again, it is near the Cherokee capital, and a number of our members or potential members live in that area. Also, the authorities in Salem knew that from the beginning we had had some ministry to the African American slaves in the area owned by the Cherokee, and their prospects for that seemed good around New Echota as well. And so things were prosperous and looking good for starting this second mission. Steiner, by the way, when he was down there, attended the council in the Cherokee capital and was involved in the dedicatory prayer for the National Council House of the Cherokee Nation at its formal opening. And so that gave us, again, not only good reception, but favorable treatment from the Cherokee. So he was looking around for some suitable places, and let's see, he wrote back saying Yushkalogi or Yushkalogi, and we'll say again more about the variants of this name, is a fine large creek with very clear water. It has good building sites extending for several miles on both banks, on which several settlements have been located and which could support sizable settlements placed close to each other. For there are still a number of fine springs on land which is not yet occupied, and on both sides there lies somewhat higher land, which though of poor quality and hardly suitable for cultivation, could yet well be used as pasture for cattle. Lower down the creek, 5 to 6 miles from the existing settlements, is a mill. The creek is strong enough to drive a number of mills, even in dry weather. On this land live our baptized members, those who would like to have closer ties with us, and our friends, who are all eager to have the gospel. And above, that is upstream, resides Major Ridge, a respected man who can really be considered fit for the kingdom of God. His wife, Susanna, a sister who has truly experienced mercy, is baptized. And he states that his dwelling lies 6 miles from Coosa River, approximately 70 miles from the settlements in the state of Alabama, and 120 miles from Catawba, which is in Tennessee, not ours. The projected seat of government of, Alabama. And William Hicks lives 2 short miles below, and he was baptized recently. So as you can see, this was land which had some physical advantages to it, as well as having some of our more prominent members living in the area. So they decided here in Salem, okay, we'll start the second mission. And of course that meant that they would need more staff because there was no way that the Gambols could serve that as well as New Spring Place. Fortunately, Johann Renata Schmidt, who had been serving in the missions in Canada at New Fairfield, was ready for a change and could be spared. And so they called him to be the second missionary amongst the Cherokee there. He stopped here in Salem on his way down to marry Gertrude Spanauer. And you had to have a wife. They didn't want to send a single brother down there. So he stopped off just long enough to get married. And they went on their way and arrived in Spring Place on the 13th of October, 1820. Now, there was going to be a shuffling because the Schmidts, the Johann Renatus and the new Mrs., were supposed to take over Spring Place. That was already established and going, and so they could run that. And the Gambolds were experienced amongst the Cherokee, and it was thought that they would make a better start with the new mission. And so they were to move to Ushkalagi, south of New Echota, and they did. And along with them went Brother Gambol's brother, Joseph. And he's a very interesting fellow as well. He was one of the few recorded cases where a marriage, arranged marriage, simply did not work out. And he and his wife were not able to stay together. She wanted to stay here, which meant he really needed to go somewhere. And so it was thought that, well, you know, his brother John could use some help down there for a short time, so they sent Joseph down for a brief period to help out. And it worked out. He liked it. He didn't want to return here, and so he ended up staying there virtually the rest of his life. And he became particularly popular amongst the Cherokee children, who called him the Bumblebee. And the reason for that is not that he hummed while he worked, but simply that he was rather stout, and his physique looked like a bumblebee to them. So that may have been part of his popularity. But anyway, so we have the Gambol's extended family down at the new station now, except that, of course, Anna Rosina dies, and that was a great sadness and harm to the work. However, Brother Gambold, or the brothers Gambold, soldiered on, and they did get the mission started, and Salem worried about his being down there alone, or their being down there alone, so they called him back in 1822 to get married again, and this time he married Anna Maria Schultz, and that seems to have worked out okay. They built a larger house at Ushkalagi. There was some new buildings at Spring Place, and by 1823, the spring of 1823, the new brother and sister Gambold were back carrying on the work. They did add members slowly, but in February of 1823, Mary and Martha McNair, who were granddaughters of James Van, our earlier friend, actually came here to Salem and attended the Female Academy and for some time. And in 1826, Sally Ridge, the daughter of Major Ridge, also came. So we had a number of Cherokee girls here in Salem in school. Now, the U.S. government thought all of this was a good idea, and so they gave us an additional $800 for getting the new mission really going. And $800 in the 1820s was quite a bit of money. And so that was a big help. So it looks like things, except for Brother Gambold's sadness, but still, things are going well. Spring Place was going well also, and so it looks like things were just about to take off, and then the state of Georgia entered the picture, and Georgia simply wanted the Cherokee land. That's all there is to it, and they were going to get it one way or another. Despite the government assurances, it began to look like Georgia would get its way, And the Provincial Elders Conference here, not wanting to waste any money in case it didn't turn out well, and not being sure that if the Cherokee were forced to leave there that we could go with them or could stand the expense of starting new mission stations, they instructed both Spring Place and Ushgalagi to do only the most necessary building. And so the expansion which we were ready for didn't come at that point. We were also hampered by the death of the first and second principal chiefs in 1827, and the Cherokee are restless, and that made our authorities here even less ready to invest any money in the work. Then in 1827, Brother Gambold, John Gambold himself, died at Ushgalagi after many, many faithful years of service. And that caused another shift in the mission personnel. The Johann Renatus Schmidt and his wife were moved down to Ushgalagi, and the Behans, who had served earlier at Spring Place, now after 15 years returned to the mission. So once again, we are staffed again, have had a bump in the road with Brother Gambold's death, but it looks like things are beginning to settle down. We actually expanded some in 1828. Henry Clotter, who was a teacher in the Salem Boys School here, was sent down to teach at Ushgalagi. And the local Salem people were very proud that a child of this congregation is serving in a foreign mission. And that was something that, as Moravians, they were very pleased about. In 1829, he returned here to marry Charlotte. Well, it should be pronounced Ruda, but some of them call it Reedy. And that's the way it was anglicized later. But anyway, so again, it looks like things are just about to take off. And then in 1829, somebody discovered gold in the Cherokee land. And that was the end of it. By 1831, it was obvious that Georgia was going to take the land no matter what, no matter who stood in their way. The Cherokee, of course, appealed to Andrew Jackson for help, the great white father, who was, shall we say, less than helpful. In 1831, the government ordered all whites of bad character out of the Cherokee land. Now, that's understandable, but it included us too, because they interpreted bad character as anybody who thought the Cherokee had any rights to be able to keep their land. This drug on for some years, but as you will recall, 1837 and 1838, the Cherokee were finally, all of them, forced to leave, except for those enterprising souls who hid in the mountains of North Carolina and became the Eastern Band, to whom we're also grateful for contributions towards our translation project. But in 1838, the Moravian missionaries held their final service east of the Mississippi, and it was held on the 16th of September, which is, of course, Ministers' Covenant Day. So an appropriate date, but that was the end of the mission there, not only at Spring Place, but also at Ushgalagi. So it did not last all that long, but as you will see from the forthcoming records of the Moravians among the Cherokee, a good bit was done there, and there's some interesting details in the diaries and other things like that. But that was the end of it. And that's the end of the first part of the talk. And now for the slideshow, which Richard has very obligingly put together in his usual amusing fashion. The title slide is informative when it comes up, and this deals with the name of the mission station. Richard has entitled this Uchga what? because as you can see from the various things around, it was spelled in many different ways, from Uchgilogi, Uchgilogi, Yushkalogi, Uchgalunga, and Yuskaloki, and Yukilugi. So it could have been anyway, and you have to remember now, as we were trying to get this name, which is a Cherokee name for the area, there was no way of writing this down in a standard form. The Cherokee syllabary was just on the horizon. And you also have to remember that these are German missionaries listening to Cherokee pronounce the name, trying to make sense of it to English people. So it's no wonder that we got several variants on it. However, oh, by the way, what does Ushkalagi mean? We have no idea. Okay, now if I can get... But from the minutes of the PEC, you can see that they spelled it O-O-C-H-G-E-E-L-O-G-Y. And that's what we take as the official spelling of it. Whether they would have pronounced it Uchgalogi or Uchgalogi, either one would have been possible. So I sort of go halfway in between, usually, which is a Moravian thing to do. Okay. However, the state of Georgia, in their beneficence, put up a marker. And you can see how they spelled it, Uthkaloga, which is yet another variant. And but this highway marker stood for many years there to at least note that there had been a mission